Okay. Could you please say and spell your name?
My name is Philip J. Deloria, Philip, just one L, J, Deloria, Deloria. The
Great.
L is small.
Great.
Capital.
And just to get us started, could you please give me a thumbnail sketch of your travels through the world of higher education? You don't have to name institutions if you don't want to, but the kinds of institutions, the kinds of posts that you've held over the years, just your path through higher education.
Right. So, I was an undergraduate music education major, a failed performer. I taught middle school band and orchestra for 2 years. I got involved in making music videos, and then I went back and did an MA in broadcast journalism, mostly to use the cool equipment. And then I applied to an American Studies program and a program in ethnographic filmmaking. The American Studies program was at Yale. I graduated in 1994. My first job was at the University of Colorado in the history department, where I had to kind of retool myself as a historian, methodologically, and sort of conceptually too. And then I moved, after 6.5 years, I moved to the University of Michigan. I had a joint appointment in history and American culture, which is where American Studies and Ethnic Studies resides at Michigan. I came there in the middle of a tenure process, so I came there with tenure, which was nice. I'd only been there a couple of years, and the American Culture program needed a new director, chair. And so, even though I had not been at the institution long, I was allowed myself to be recruited, to become a director. Nicely, they gave me a semester to finish my book so I could be promoted. So I was promoted at the same time that I kind of became program director. So I did that for 3.5 years, 4 years, 3.5 years. I enjoyed it a lot. And then I found myself in the middle of an interesting kind of political kind of negotiation around chairs in a couple of other units. And the dean had to make something interesting. He had to move a logjam, basically. And I became the kind of tool to move the logjam. So he sent me over to this unit and said, look, do you think you'd like to be the chair of this? And he said, go over and ask. He said, go over and ask them, talk to them about stuff. And I went over there, and they all freaked out at the thought of me, coming in to do some kind of academic leadership thing over there. And with a little bit of help and twisting from the dean, they actually negotiated a very complicated sort of deal. And at the end of all that, I was both a little stunned at kind of the Machiavellian sort of character of it, but I was also kind of impressed at how he seemed to be 3 steps ahead of everybody in the game. And we ended up in a conversation, and then he said, if you're interested in continuing in administration, you were a pretty good chair. And so more or less offered me the job as the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education, which I did for 4.5 years. And it's a great job, tons of opportunity for creative kinds of things, program building, huge portfolio, everything from academic advising, curriculum oversight, college curriculum committee, evaluations and reviews of tenure cases on the quality of teaching, driving teaching excellence, tons of programs, all the living learning things, the museum, the study abroad program, the Europe program, the language resource center, the science learning center, the student academic support, and more that I'm probably not remembering at the time. So I did that. I did that for 4.5 years, and it was wonderful. It was glorious. I enjoyed it a lot.
And now you are not doing that anymore.
And now I'm not doing that anymore.
Which is probably also glorious in its way.
Well, it's interesting. I went through a dean search process at Michigan, and when you go through that process, you kind of have to get yourself. Either you get yourself to the point where you're saying, "I'm going to go forward in administration. I'm going to be a dean," and that probably means I'm interested in being a provost or a president or something like that after that. So when you go through that process, either you can get yourself there psychologically or you can't. And if you can't, you don't belong in the search, right? But I managed to get myself there. So I got to a point in my career where I was ready to embrace moving forward into academic administration. Now that actually didn't work out for various reasons. And so what that's meant has been, to me, has been either, well, let me say it better. What I then confronted was I willing to step up to academic leadership at an institution I knew and cared a lot about? Yes. Was that transferable to me being willing to uproot my life and go to another institution I did not know and did not care about? And the answer to that turned out to be no. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, it became clear to me that I was going to need to step back into scholarship and teaching. And that's not an easy transition, I think, after you've been sort of really doing things at that level, exercising your creativity, an administrative kind of role. Stepping back into a department does not look particularly interesting. The stakes seem so small.
Right. Although stepping back to scholarship must be, what's that like?
Well, when I stopped being the director of the American Culture Program, I had a year's leave, and I didn't use it very well. It was hard. Now, part of it was kind of personal stuff. My father had left a manuscript and a reader's report on his desk when he passed, and I finished that book for him, and I did editorial work on that book, and so that was one thing I did. But what I found was that it was very hard for me to jump back into my own work. It just didn't work very well. I spent too much time kind of padding around my house in a bathrobe and slippers and not really focused in. The worlds were so different that I wasn't quite there. Which is why now, at this particular moment, I'm doing a guest semester. I'm working hard at teaching. I'm teaching 2 brand new courses. Really throwing myself into that as a transition.
Yeah.
And then I'll be on leave next year, and hopefully, scholarship.
Uh-huh. Okay. Good. Well, so now I'm seeing a fork in the road, and I want to go down both paths, but I'll let you decide which order. So down, just based on what you've already said, down one path is the story of Michigan in the years that you've been there. And I mean both the state and the institution, because you've been there at a really rough time, an interesting time in the sense of the old Chinese,
Yeah.
So there's that story, and I really want to talk in detail about that, because the whole prospect of public education in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, I mean, it's just coming to a head, and I know that you must have a lot to say about that. And then down the other path is these plateaus within the institution of, being a faculty member or being a dean. Mm-hmm. And having experienced both how the world looks from those 2 vantage points and what you've learned about institutions that you feel like maybe you wish that you'd known all along, or you wish that more people knew, or, so I don't know which order it makes sense to you to move into these, but these are 2 areas I'd really like to explore with you.
Right. Well, why don't we do the second one first?
Okay.
Well, so I think a couple things. I mean, as a department chair, that's a level that requires, real care, concern, and intimacy for your faculty colleagues, right? I mean, you have the Kleenex box on your table. You learn all the stuff that's unpleasant and sometimes worse than that. On the other hand, you also find yourself in these given opportunities to really help people in a very quiet but very necessary kind of way. It seems to me that, what we always say at Michigan is the department chair actually has the hardest job, right? At some moments, you're the junior representative of the college administration, and you're telling your faculty this is what's happening. But you're also representative of your faculty to the upper administration. You have to navigate through that. What I found was that it was a very... I spent much more time thinking about faculty matters, sometimes in relation to the college, but mostly in relation to the department, the program that became a department. I keep waffling back and forth between those terms because it's a program that became a department, a director that became a chair, all of that kind of stuff. So I found myself like stepping out of the faculty role, certainly, but not so far out of it that that I wasn't in a position to have a lot of sympathy, mostly for my colleagues, some impatience, right, with my colleagues who were knuckleheads, right, because it happens, it just happens. Stepping up to the dean's office was a really, really different thing, and administrators talk about this all the time, of course, that the horizon is bigger. You're now seeing the entire college. You're thinking about the natural sciences in ways that you would never think about that in a history or American studies, program at all. You think about them a lot. You think about the weirdness of their structures, their funding structures, their support structures. You think about how damn expensive they are. Sometimes you get a little resentful, of them. You think about social sciences in ways you've never really thought about much before. So you find yourself, I found myself expanding my mind in all kinds of ways that I really liked. I loved hanging out with economists. I loved hanging out with physicists, and learning new things. So that's the landscape of the horizon of the college. But the other thing is when you're at the landscape of the college, you can also see the landscape of the provost's office and the president's office in ways that you had not been able to see, as a faculty member. And so, it probably didn't hurt that my wife was running the development office for the college, and so we were engaged with a lot of things, at the level of the university. And even if you're not sitting there at the provost level, you're close enough to understand what's going on there. You come to understand budgets and budget models in ways that a faculty member never has an opportunity, to really understand. You understand some of the decisions that seem crazy to you as a faculty member, but actually are completely logical, from the perspective of an upper administrator. You understand certain things about external relations that you never think that much about as a faculty member. So you see all these new things. And, in my experience, you're able to kind of understand and mobilize the resources of the university to do cool stuff. And that's the part that's very exciting. So for me, I think, the thought of going, nothing against my faculty colleagues, they're wonderful, but as it's not only that, may you live in interesting times, it's that why do people fight so hard, when the stakes are so low, right? I see the conversations that happen at the departmental level. They're super important. I get that. I'll be going back into those conversations soon. But they don't seem all that important to me, really. Mm-hmm. They seem very small and cribbed and stuff, because you have had this expansive kind of thing.
Uh-huh. It's interesting, though. So the experience, though, that you describe of moving into upper administration and getting this whole different scan of the landscape, and learning how to think about things that you've had the luxury of never thinking about before. This is exactly why, and you know this, when you're on the faculty and a faculty member moves up into one of those positions, it always looks like the person has started drinking the Kool-Aid.
Exactly. You crossed over to the dark side.
Exactly.
Right.
So how can you explain that to faculty?
It's
because not just explain it, but kind of translate it. And is there not like something useful that that you can kind of bring back to the faculty and kind of just more productive ways of thinking about how to engage the administration?
Yeah.
Or, I don't know.
Yeah,
there are a lot of
totally
different...
true. When you see a faculty member who's come off of a college executive committee or come out of administration, right, and they come back into the department, what you realize is the department is thinking tactically. What should we say to the college to get them to do what we want? They're not thinking strategically, right? What are the college's aims and goals here? What are the college's constraints? Why is the college asking us to count student credit hours, for example? So my colleagues have thought, well, this is the corporatization of the university. They're doing bean counting and all this stuff. It's like, well, the fact is our history department has something like 84 faculty members and, 200 majors or something like that. It's out of balance, right? If you're actually managing for the good of the college, it's out of balance. Because the ratio is just not right. It's just not right. And where did those students go? When I got to Michigan, there were 600 history majors, right? Where did those students go? Well, they went to international relations. They went to psychology. They went to econ. They went to maybe poli-sci. Have those departments grown? A little bit. Have they grown proportional to the number of students they're serving? No, they haven't, right? So you have to do a rebalancing within the college. There's just an example, right? If you're at the dean's level, that absolutely makes sense. There's a logic to running the college that causes you to want to manage by data, not just by, or it's actually better for a department to know that you're running something with some data behind it, not just like, well, he's more persuasive than she is, she's more persuasive than he is. The econ department is arrogant and louder than the history department, therefore they get lines. Or right? I mean, so if you know that you're actually running a college, as we've done, I think, very well at Michigan, with some sort of sense about how data works. Well, this is an example. I don't want to just belabor it, but coming back into a department, you can explain that, right? And you can ask your colleagues not to think tactically, but to think strategically and to actually inform themselves about certain things. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree that this is a good idea, because we don't, right? But the fact is, Michigan, for example, we've got a Department of Slavic Languages. Well, when you're managing by data, right, they never come out to seem to justify themselves, right? But the fact is, we believe in having a Department of Slavic Languages, and we're going to have one. And we're going to have art history, right? We believe in certain philosophical things that are central to a liberal arts education. The fact that we're managing to understand doesn't necessarily mean, right, that we're going to actually drop the axe on someone. Now, that's just my experience. I know lots of places, programs come, programs go. I mean, Michigan has certainly had, this gets into the other question, right? I mean, we used to have religious studies. We used to have geography. We used to have a journalism school, right? All those things went by the wayside. They're gone.
Right. There are a couple of questions that occur to me here. One is, I guess the big question is there a way that faculty could be given the incentive to think in the way that you're talking about, rather than in thinking in these kind of turfish, like small skirmish, guard the perimeters of our little, encampment. And there's the second, I guess, as a secondary or subsidiary question, does that come from the structures of departments, or does that come from the kind of intellectual ethos of disciplines?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to go back to this example, there, you do end up setting up structural competition, right, among departments, despite yourself, right? Even if you don't want it to happen. Some part of it, I think, does turn into disciplinary kinds of things. There's certain fields and disciplines that have certain kinds of characters, and certain kinds of ways of thinking and managing, themselves, their field, the ways they produce knowledge, that I think lead them to a different structural position in relation to other departments. Other times, though, it's a lot, I think, the bodies on the ground and the people who are, and how effectively a college actually is able to work with department chairs and communicate things, to departments. And I wouldn't say that this is a great virtue of higher education, right? There's some real communication gaps that show up, I think, between colleges, chairs, departments. So you can have rank and file faculty upset about certain things that might or might not change with a better communication chain and better, sort of more clarity about what things are, about. Yeah. So I think faculty could. Well, I think it's important. We tell faculty it's important to do service, and a lot of times faculty, what they hear is important for you to be on the graduate committee and to put in your time as the DGS or the chair, maybe, or whatever. But I think it's really important for faculty to do the kind of service work that gets them into these different horizons, so they actually see, experience stuff. First of all, they come to understand that there's other points of view out there that are pretty legitimate. And I think they see, or they maybe would see, that it's much better to have a faculty member than a kind of senior staff member actually running things. And that the other not to sort of complain about this, but faculty administrators work 2, 3, 4 times as hard as faculty members. There's a sort of sense that everybody's sitting around in an office doing nothing. It's totally not true, right? Faculty administrators work incredibly, incredibly hard. I mean, I was basically in the office at 8 in the morning, stay until 5 at night, and then probably going to an evening event, and then going home and doing an email till 11 o'clock, like every single day. And, so there's a kind of relentlessness to that. It's not that we should love and appreciate our administrators, right, necessarily, but the fact is we should understand what they do and how hard they work and the depth of knowledge that they actually end up acquiring, and that it's not the case that they're always wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you used the word corporate, which is certainly, I mean, I understand what that refers to from a faculty member's point of view.
Yeah.
Is there anything useful kind of couched in that term in terms of what you've seen about the operations of the university?
I think our biggest disaster at Michigan, as it has been at many places, was trying to move to a shared services model using Accenture, an outside corporate consultant, right, who didn't really understand the university. This could have been a functional kind of change. Absolutely wasn't, and in part because of the critique leveled was absolutely right. This was a moment of the corporatization of the university. There's no.
And in your case, was that driven by the state, or was that driven by the provost's office?
Yeah, it was driven by the provost's office, basically, and the budget office. The budget office administered it, VP for Budgetary Affairs.
But this is happening nationwide.
Yeah,
lots of places. Places like this at Yale. Yeah. So how do you understand that? From a faculty member's point of view, it just looks like all of the college presidents and provosts went to a summer camp, and they came back, and they started doing the same thing everywhere.
Well, I think that's what happened. Right?
Okay,
I totally think that's what happened. Right? They all, they all go to the same meetings, right? And they hobnob with each other, and they sort of talk about things, and it's like dominoes, right? Or I think basically, a company like Accenture might come in or something, there's connections in there, there's a pipeline in there, and all of a sudden people are like, yeah, well, let's do this, we'll do this. I mean, we did it because, we are always in Michigan doing, as every place is, we're doing budget projections. And, we both wanted to, we are kind of, so Michigan's an interesting place, right, in that we have a lot of applications. We do not have to worry about applications, really, at least not right now. So we could take and enroll a full class of out-of-state students, right, who are basically paying full freight, and we could do fine. And we could ignore the state, can't really do that politically. And because we can't really do that politically, we're trying to manage expenses at the same time we're trying to manage revenue. And it's there, I said it. It sounds very corporate, right? But the fact is, it's true, right? It's an institution that brings in revenue. It's money, and that's what pays the salaries and gets things done. So this was on the managing expenses side. Our college had done a shared services kind of model, and we'd done our own 6% budget reduction. So Michigan's a very decentralized place, which means that our college, we projected, I don't know, it was 5 years ago or something like that. We looked at sort of where we were at, where we were going to be if we kept on the same growth curve, and we realized if we could cut 6%, right, all of a sudden we could actually do some reallocation, which we did, right, and we could lower that curve significantly. It would be good for us in the long run. So we did a decentralized 6% budget cut. Every department had to figure out ways to get there. We did that, and we moved to some shared services things. So we had satellite offices, stuff like that. From my point of view, it wasn't great, but it was scaled at the appropriate scale, which is to say, we're going to put the 5 computer guys that are kind of scattered around here into a centralized place, and we're going to let them be cross-functional with each other. We're actually going to provide some better service. Nobody actually loses their job. We just shift up the model. We're going to do the same thing with finances and accounting stuff or travel or whatever. So that was a reasonable way to do it. And then there's a little attrition, and you've got a more functional organization. Okay, fine. When you did what we did this last year, which was an unmitigated disaster, like, no, we're gonna like,
that was the Accenture.
yeah, we're gonna build a central place. Everything's gonna be online, or at best on the phone. Everybody's gonna be compressed, and we're gonna tell you right now we're cutting 80 jobs, right? So the scale is wrong. And I'll tell you, I was one of the first people to call the service center to ask for a question about my benefits, and it was a total disaster, right? We all knew it would be, right? We all knew it would be. So I think what we did in the college was just about as much as you can do in that kind of centralization thing. But when you blow it up to the university level, it was a huge mistake. Mm-hmm. And every university is making the same mistake right now.
Mm-hmm. Is there any way out of that? Once you've once you've built the building and put everybody into it,
yeah.
I mean, undoing that just seems
hard.
Immense.
I mean, basically what they came in and told us was, hey, we're going to save $17 million. Oh, I mean 6. I mean maybe 2.
Right.
Right? So all of a sudden the numbers became a hugely moving target, but always going down. But like you say, they were too far into it. They were committed to it.
Right. An experience here has been that one of the unintended consequences is that you have people actually working way below their pay grade. You have mm-hmm. professors doing clerical work.
Yeah, exactly.
all over the campus.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. Where you once had something that was more or less right-sized, now you've got... And the idea, the rationale was exactly not to have this, right? It was to have a person at the appropriate level doing transactional work, another person at the next level up doing, kind of administrative oversight work, all this kind of stuff. Here, it just doesn't work, right? Mm-hmm. From my point of view, and I'll tell you, my unit, my undergrad ed unit, we were budgeted to lose 12 people. At the end of the day, I kind of negotiated and bartered it down to 6. But these were the, in Michigan they're called the key administrators. I mean, they're basically the most important kind of senior financial HR person in a unit. And where did we lose them? Study abroad, super complicated with crazy stuff, currency rates and, all kinds of stuff like that. Student academic advising, right? One of the busiest, service units, that we could possibly have. The undergraduate research opportunities program processing, thousands of students a semester. I mean, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to look at this and think, oh boy, there's some bad stuff coming, right? That's exactly what's happened. Yeah. So, and this isn't the only thing, but I think it's important to sort of figure out. It's not fair to sort of broad brush any kind of management of a college as corporatization, right? Some things are corporatization and are driven by corporate kinds of interests, and other things are just, oftentimes academics trying to do their best to manage something effectively, because it really is, it's management, and you can't pretend to be, a kind of researchy academic and run a college. If you do that, you're going to run the college into the ground, and then what are you? So I think it's worth sort of trying. I would like this discourse to be better informed about what's, what's good, what's reasonable, what's something to be debated, what's something to be completely avoided, what's evil. There's a whole spectrum there.
You made a really important distinction earlier. You were talking about faculty administrators as opposed to just administrators. And that seems crucial. I mean, in shared services is probably the best example of this, or at least it's the one most ready to hand. Because you can be an administrator and still look at the university as an educator. Or you can be an administrator and look at the university like a factory.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But my feeling is that the numbers of true educators in university administrations is thinning. Is that your impression as well?
I think it's kind of like what happens to our kids when they play sports, right? They get tracked in junior high, people are watching them. I mean, I know scouts that are watching junior high kids, right, for college. You get tracked into upper administration really fast, So, I mean, one of the first things that happened to me, I think when I went in the dean's office, was they send you to the CIC leadership training program, which, when you look at the roster, has cranked out a ton of deans. I mean, it's kind of the dean training ground. So you go there and you start on the administrative track fast. And if you are quick to abandon your scholarship, right, your scholarly interests and your willingness to be in the classroom, and if you're quick to do that, I think you turn the corner, right? It feels to me like it's good for an administrator. So I taught the entire time that I was doing administration, because it's really important. You can't be the associate dean for undergraduate education and not be in the classroom teaching undergraduates. That kept me honest, trying to maintain a research profile. That kept me honest. And kept me in the game as a faculty member. I wish I'd gone to more of my own departmental meetings. I really didn't do that, but that would be a good thing to do too, right? So I think it's one of those things where hang on to it as long as you possibly can, because once you really kind of make the commitment and you turn the corner, then I think, and you have to do it at some point, but at that point you become a professional administrator, and it's very easy to lose. Well, it's easy. It may not be very easy. I think people resist it a lot. Good leaders resist it a lot, but it's easy to lose track of where you started, as a faculty administrator. I mean, not to sort of name names, but so I'm not going to. But I know people, out there, university presidents, folks, they gave up on it immediately, right? Immediately, and they truly became more on the corporate side, right? They cared more about the structure. As a factory, as an institution, and less about the end product.
Mm-hmm. What's before we go down that second road? What from your point of view is driving the reorganization of labor in universities, the casualization, adjuncts,
Mm-hmm.
The various assaults on tenure in different parts of the country? How do you understand those pretty dramatic
Mm-hmm.
developments in the last, it seems like it's all happening very fast. In the last 10 years, 15 years.
Yeah. I think it's a range of stuff going on, for sure. We could talk about the big discursive ideological stuff, right? The devaluing of education, the elevation of, professional vocational kinds of things. We could talk about status arms race, although that's a kind of old story, I think, at this point, although it still goes on, right? At Michigan, it's we moved to a, tuition-based budget model around 2002. So we got there before anybody else did, because why? Because the state, this leads us into stuff, the other conversation, but, in some ways, it's the drying up of money and resources, I think, sits underneath a lot of these other different kinds of moves. They're supported by all kinds of other stuff, but when you're really scraping around on the budget, it becomes easy to sort of think about these things. To think, well, it wouldn't hurt us to sort of let that one go and bring in a lecturer, to make up the difference. One of the things we tried to set a firm principle at Michigan, but it was a retrenchment for us, right? A firm principle saying 66% of the classes are going to be taught by faculty, no more than 33%, lectures, no more than a third in lecturers. Very hard to get back to that because we let it creep up, right? But that was a philosophical position that one could feel proud of, kind of.
This is
right?
what it's come to.
right, exactly. And the fact is, right, there's certain places, right, teaching English composition, teaching foreign languages, where you're not going to actually have a tenure track, workforce, right? You're really going to have lecturers, because they're not going to do research on teaching, 30 sections of Spanish, that kind of stuff. But I think, as you're trying to navigate budgets, it's a series of, oftentimes it's a series of small decisions that start adding up to something that starts to look like a policy. It starts to look like a policy, and it kind of becomes a policy, right? And the next thing you know, you're kind of implementing pieces of it in different locations. I don't know that. I mean, certainly, I never saw people going in saying, "Yeah, we're going to set up a really draconian, kind of policy. We're going to like dismantle the institution and all that we." I mean, no one ever says that, right? It's a creeping. I mean, I think it's a creeping thing as much as anything. I don't know.
It goes back to something we were talking about earlier, though, about the reallocations and the reapportionment kind of as to meet changing needs. And I mean, at one level, that makes perfect sense. Of course, we don't need, or well, maybe we will. Well, maybe we will. But I was going to say we don't need as many Sovietologists as we used to, right?
Right.
But as an example, so at one level, it makes perfect sense. There's another level, though. Where at its kind of through the arc of its heyday, the kind of post-World War II democratization of higher education, the liberal ideal, there was a kind of social contract there that said, you can become a Sovietologist and we will hire you and you will never have to fight for the value of what you do, because it's assumed that many things have value, and value is not the bottom line.
Right.
It's something else. And so what do you think of that? I mean, as a proposition, that there is a kind of social contract that is being torn apart here.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's... I don't know if it's being, like, ripped to shreds, right? I mean, certainly Michigan, there's a lot of room for, and there has been a lot of room for both of those things to kind of play, I mean, you have to, well, right, it is true that you can imagine moments where the Sovietologist, right, is not going to be the next hire. Those tend to be departmental, I mean, that's not a college decision for us, that's a departmental decision, because the flip side of it is, well, how do we actually staff the econ course? How do we staff Econ 101 if we're not going to tell history, guess what, guys? You can put in for a position for next year to replace your Sovietologist. It might take you a couple of years before you get that. And if you really value that position, keep putting in for it. It'll come back around to you, right? But in the meantime, we got to hire 3 economists, right? Because otherwise, what are we doing? We're hiring lecturers, right, to do this stuff. So, are you going to feel good about us increasing our number of lecturers to teach core classes? No, actually, you would not feel good about that, right? But that's what we're going to have to do over in this department if we can't think about sort of doing a college-wide reallocation, stuff. And that doesn't necessarily mean, like, I'm chopping you in order to, it means slow, kind of managed change over time, right? I mean...
How much responsibility is on departments, then, to look ahead and try to train graduates for the world ahead instead of reproducing ourselves, which is what we do best?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's...
And is it possible? Like, do you know of models that are working in terms of places that are kind of thinking about graduate education in those terms? Not just cutting numbers,
right.
But like actually thinking about training differently.
Right. Well, I would say, I mean, if just to sort of, stay with Michigan models, for example, I would say American Culture program at Michigan is an interesting kind of place that way. So this is a program that was an American Studies program up to the early 90s. And then, had an external review where they said, you ought to be thinking about ethnic studies and the ethnic studies, American studies relationship. And that led over the 90s to sort of new kinds of opportunities, and then a huge explosion of hiring around when Michigan was fighting the affirmative action lawsuits.
Do you know who was on that review committee?
I don't know the whole committee, but Michael Cowan was on it. The rest of them may come to me in a minute. I don't know.
That just seems like such a seismic moment.
Yeah.
When Michigan starts thinking about the world in that way, I mean, that really changed a lot of things.
It was huge. I mean, it was huge. And they, they built that program, a little piecemeal, right? I mean, strong on Latino stuff, early on, Native American, not much going on. Then there was this kind of interesting Asian, and then Asian Pacific, Michigan hired 5 Pacific Island folks, But this came out of, here was a moment where you saw an alignment of a department, a field, right? Some sort of forward-thinking sense of where the field may be going. I think that was right, or at least one of the paths for American study. So field, department, these nice external reviewers, college, and upper, presidential and provost level, right? So they built that around provost's, funding, basically. There was a moment where, we were searching, kind of 8 different lines within each of those 3 ethnic studies areas. It was an interesting, wonderful, crazy moment. I feel really lucky to have been a part of that. There was a moment where you could feel super proud to be part of that institution. They're going to the Supreme Court, they're doing this hiring, they're doing all this. It was great. But now, here we are 14 years later, right? And, well, that ethnic studies, American studies thing is kind of, ethnic studies still important, right? It still matters. Training a diverse population of graduate students still important. But now that model doesn't feel quite so compelling in terms of graduate education. And so, they've turned to a new kind of combination where ethnic studies stuff remains important, but thinking about digital cultures, digital humanities, and actually they made a whole bunch of hires. And the new hires are people who do ethnic studies and digital stuff. So those are not easy to find, actually. But the fact that that's where they're putting their energy as a department, and the college is supporting them in that feels like when we're talking to graduate students, I don't feel too bad about saying, this is a kind of a growing, interesting thing, in the field. It's kind of here now. It's a little undefined from my point of view. It's clearly got some futurity attached to it. You could do worse, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Michigan, over the last 14 years.
Yeah.
First of all, can you just narrate it, at least briefly, for people who might not know the arc of that story? And you've been there for all of it.
Yeah. Well, so Michigan, some of those earlier, cut programs that I refer to came out of the 80s, right? So first big budget crisis with lots and lots of stuff going on. That was before I got there, but the legacy of that kind of, echoes and resonates, around. So, yeah, Michigan's been in a slump as a state for a really long time, and it's caused the university to move away from the state, obviously away from the state-funded kind of program. I wish I could remember the exact number that we get from the state, but it's hovering around the 10% mark, as it is for a lot of places. So, because Michigan, I think, was among the very elite publics, safety school for the Ivies for a lot of students, big out-of-state, kind of population, we were in a position to do things that I think a lot of other schools aren't, right? Which is to say, we're really going to go tuition-driven, and because we were decentralized, it's a 50-50 tuition split. So, unit of enrollment, unit of instruction, that works out about right. You lose a little bit over here, but you make it up over there. Money flows into the colleges themselves. It doesn't flow centrally. That's interesting, right? Flows into the colleges and then gets taxed to fund the central thing, which then flows back through supplemental budgets and things like that. So the provost is able to push priorities. But, every university has their own saying, right? At Harvard, they say tub on its own bottom. At Michigan, it's like you eat what you kill, right? Which is maybe better than the corporate thing, but not by much. But, there's a real strong incentive, to manage your own shop at the level of the college or the school. And you've got a ton of autonomy, maybe more than any place in the country, in terms of running that. So under that system, you saw a lot of schools and colleges actually doing pretty well. There's always this tweaking and adjusting. What's going to be the in-state, out-of-state budget, balance? What's going to be the tuition increase over here, over there? It's been important to me, I think, and many people to say if we're going to take more out-of-state students, we got to double down on the state of Michigan in terms of our own students, UP students from Detroit. Those kinds of things. But so basically, we went to that model around 2002, implemented it, kind of refined it right about just in time for the crash. We took some hits, we did some budget cutting, but in general, we were able to kind of just weather right through that relative to our peers. Mm-hmm. So we looked at the Cal schools, and just like things were crazy for them, or we looked at schools that were running a lot off of endowment, which we never did, So Michigan was, had like a 3.5% payoff on a rolling 7-year average. I mean, like super conservative. Mm-hmm. So we never let ourselves get into operating around our endowment. So we kind of slid through that, in an interesting and reasonable way. The downside of it is more pressure each year to take more out-of-state students, which means richer, whiter, smarter, actually. And that runs directly counter to our mission as a public, right? I mean, no, we're here to serve the state. We're here to serve students who maybe aren't going to compete with, kids who are getting turned away from Yale and Harvard and Princeton. So those have been two missions that have been running a budgetary driven thing that runs kind of counter to the public mission, the institution. And that, I mean, for me, that was the toughest and worst kind of nut to crack, over the last 4 or 5 years. I don't know. Is that enough of a narrative?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So, but where do you come down in your thinking about this? Like, if you were president or chancellor, or, how would you thread that needle?
Yeah. More or less in the way that they're doing it, which is the consequence of this really has been around diversity, I think, in terms of Michigan. I think you can never let it get to the point where you're taking, say, 50% out-of-state students. When I was at Colorado, actually, we were taking something like 54%.
And charging them an arm and a leg.
Yeah. And they were all skiers, right? It was the skiing budget, right? Mm-hmm. And there was a moment when I was there as a grad student, I think, where the legislature passed some kind of thing about like taking not more than X percentage out-of-state students. And it was this huge budget hit. I mean, it was like they didn't buy books in the library for 4 years or something. It was crazy, right? It was totally crazy. So in Michigan, we're at the other end, right? Colorado up here trying to cut back. In Michigan, we're trying to sort of think how you manage that growth of the out-of-state population.
But still serve the state.
And what you're doing is, you're doing a frank cross-subsidy, right? You're saying, thank you, New Jersey student. Some portion of your tuition is going to go to pay the scholarship for the student from Michigan.
Yeah.
Right. So, it is what it is.
How much difference has the current governor made in all of this?
Well, it's not like Scott Walker or anything like that. Thank God. I mean, he's an interesting guy, Rick Snyder, right? So he ran as a moderate. But he was handed a very
ripped off the mask.
Exactly, tore off the mask. Had a very conservative legislature, which he backed and supported the whole way through. I mean, all kinds of things. But I think he also has, he's got a few commitments to education and to higher education. So, we've seen some cuts. The thing at Michigan that's interesting is the sort of relationship across the state, as it is in a lot of places with a lot of state schools. Right, so Michigan, as opposed to Michigan State, as opposed to Lake Superior State or Central, Western, Eastern, these kinds of things. Wayne, so we're clearly seen, and rightly, as the kind of privileged kid on the block. But we also have this. We have a bit of a bit of daylight between us and the legislature. We've got all kinds of safety mechanisms that make us pretty unique. And I think he knows that. So he's been able to kind of try to help some of these other schools out while not helping us out, knowing that we're going to get by. We'll be okay. But he's never really come in with a super aggressive, cut or an attack on the faculty. He's pretty quiet, I think, when it comes to, to higher education.
Is the
and he's not going to get worse now. I mean, he is what he is.
Mm-hmm.
Legislature will be worse.
So, given your experience at all these different levels and kind of how you've seen the landscape and how you've seen it change over a couple of decades, what's your overall kind of outlook for the prospects of higher education? Mm-hmm. What does the university 20 years from now look like?
Yeah. Oh. Well, I don't think it's going to look quite as different as I think many people think it will or would like to think it will. You get these long-standing institutions. I don't think, so for example, I don't think Silicon Valley is going to come in and kill the university. There's no way. As the parent of a 20-year-old and a 22-year-old, I can tell you I will pay anything to get them the hell out of the house, right? Okay, well, that's me, I know.
Even University of Colorado out-of-state tuition.
My son applied there. Yeah, I probably would not have paid out-of-state tuition at the University of Colorado, but I think so there's clearly going to be changes, around financing, around sort of student populations, around teaching, around all these things. I don't think it's going to be this kind of crazy, huge, disruptive kind of deal where everybody just learns off a computer in their mom's bedroom. That dream, right? Is sort of broken and fragmented, and there's no point in feeling gleeful about it, right? It was a moment, so stuff's going to change. Some of that change is going to be driven by non-faculty members, and I think that's one of the things we have to think hard about. We've, like many places, have done these kind of things. This is where the presidents are all at the same conference together. Let's throw $50 million into innovation, right? So here we have this moment where we're cutting stuff to the bone, and all of a sudden the provost comes up with $50 million, right, to drive innovation in teaching and solving the world's great problems, this kind of stuff. And what happens is faculty members, it turns out, are not very good at driving the kind of large-scale innovation of teaching, right? I've been on this committee, our third century committee. I've watched the proposals come in. They're all earnest, they're serious, they're interesting, they're good, but none of them really is at the scale of the transformational scale, So that's going to come to us from outside, and I think we have to be like totally aware of that landscape. We have to be watching it. It's going to change stuff up, but I don't think in a way that anybody expects. So when I hear all these Silicon Valley guys talk, I don't really buy any of it yet. Mm-hmm. Something will happen, but not what they're saying is going to happen.
We aren't just going to be reduced to content.
No, I don't think so. I did a bunch of focus groups with students last year, and I was watching a bunch of focus groups, run by a guy who's really into, the flipped classroom and all this. And so he's like, wouldn't it be cool? He's telling the students, right, wouldn't it be cool if you came home and you got to watch a video of your professor delivering the lecture, and then you came in and you got to solve problems, And the students are all like, oh, screw you, man. They're like, we've got that. And first of all, our faculty can't implement it. And who wants to watch 3 hours of faculty talking heads on a video at night, right? That sounds like in the educational TV programs in the 1970s. No, we don't want that. They're like, we want the charismatic lecturer. This is what they want, right? They want the charismatic lecturer. So student after student in these groups are like, well, it's Jim Adams, it's Ralph Williams, it's the guy who doesn't use notes and can hold my attention for an hour. So there's certain kinds of things there, performative qualities, right? So, when I work, with faculty, it's kind of like you have to have so many tools in the kit, right? You have to be able to do the electronic stuff. You have to be able to make a screencast and make it, stick. And you have to be able to stand up and give a charismatic lecture, right? You got to be able to do all those things. It feels to me like the value, we're going to continue to reinvent the value around the human proposition, I think, because that's where faculty are, they care about, and it's where students are, I think. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So, I don't know. I'm fundamentally Luddite and optimistic in a weird kind of way.
And despite the Scott Walkers of the world, do you think that as a society we can keep our faith in the importance of education?
It's a tough question, right? It's easy to look at that and get gloomy about it.
Well, one of the other people that I asked this question of said something that I hadn't thought about, but I found it a compelling answer. Unfortunately, he said that this was the 20 years from now what the university looks like, and he painted a kind of dystopic picture of a two-tiered system in which there's the kind of the schools for the rich, where there is tenure and there are faculty, and university life looks much like it does now. And then there's this other tier that is mostly adjuncts, and it's the kind of failed democratic dream of what education once was. That sounds totally plausible to me.
Yeah, I think it is possible. I don't know if it's plausible. Maybe it's plausible. I don't know. I tend to be more optimistic about this stuff.
That's good. Well, somebody needs to be. Yeah. So, but where does that come from?
Yeah, I don't know. Where does it come from? I mean, maybe it's just a sort of blind faith in institutions that have a really long life. The university, the church, these things I think don't go away as easily as, and I don't think they're destroyed as easily as
they're damn stubborn.
Yeah.
So actually, this kind of goes back to where we started it with your administrative experience, and this maybe it's an optimistic place to end, but given the stubbornness of institutions and how implacable they feel when you're trying to change them, how is your experience, especially as a dean but also as a faculty member, oriented you to look at the question of how much difference an individual can make in a place like Michigan, in a place like Yale, in a place like Berkeley?
Yeah. That could be an occasion for an optimistic kind of thing, or not, depending, right? Yeah. God. I mean, I think my own experience is an individual can make a huge difference. Now there's certain parts of the structure you can't tear down. There's certain kinds of things that the thing is a slow battleship to turn. Blah 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 blah. On the other hand, I found plenty of opportunity to be nimble, to support people doing good work, to create new possibilities, new structures, to draw on the energy of students. I mean, so here's an interesting thing, right? I mean, every place has got these entrepreneurship things going on, and they, from a cynical view, right? It's like, oh, God, here's some more business education, vocational, kind of stuff. It's sucking up to donors. It's all this stuff. This is not what I found when I worked with students engaged in this stuff. When we talk to students and we're like, yeah, that student is alive. That student is thinking hard. That student is engaged in his or her own learning. That's what I found from the entrepreneurship kids, right? They were into this stuff, and they were actually conceiving new kinds of models for their own education and for the education and the sort of way that the institution functions. So one of the coolest things I did was took these 2 or 3 students who ran this thing called Optimize, a social innovation challenge, and I just started funneling a little bit of money to them. We built a little bit of structure, and this is one of these things where you go to these meetings and there's 300 diverse students, international, all over the place, and they're totally energized about their own learning. Well, that's interesting, right? I mean, so you can do those things. You can find the opportunities. I think you can make a huge difference as an individual. I mean, huge. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I, like that job. Why I sort of left it a little reluctantly was just the possibilities within a structure as a kind of middle manager, right? I think as and then you think, well, either as a president you're so constrained you can't do anything, or as a president you could do all kinds of amazing, crazy stuff, right? And not be Michael Crow, right? But right, but there's evidence, right? A president who wants to actually make changes and do stuff can actually change the institution around. Now, that may not be a good example of the kinds of changes that one would want to make, but it does suggest that, the institution can be moved around. So, so I don't know. I mean, it puts a lot of weight back on the academic leadership core, and I think you and I both probably agree. I don't know that group out there is able to sort of sustain the kind of weight that we would like to put on them in terms of driving positive institutional change.
The group is very small.
It's a thin talent pool too, right? I mean, some of these folks are great, but some of them are in this because they're actually not good at what they do, and they don't like what they would have done back in the department. So, I mean, I probably got 25, search firm queries over the last year for these things. Now, and I'm a guy who's said publicly, I'm not doing it anymore. I'm not going on. No, not me. No, not me. Why do they keep calling?
You're the Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, exactly. But why do they keep calling me? Because there's not that many people out there, right? And then when these recruitment firms, when they've taken these folks through interviews, they realize he's never going to get a job. She's never going to get a job. This is not, we're not actually handing out the highest quality people, to these things. So I think that the pool is small. The talent is not as great as we'd like it to be. The vision is not as great as we'd like it to be. So, yeah, you can make a change. It would be nice to sort of hope for big systemic change around that group of people. Not so sure it'll happen. There's a depressing note to end on, which doesn't say anything about corporatization or anything like that, right? It's just that these are hard jobs. I mean, I was quite relieved in some ways not to have to sort of think about that responsibility. I mean, at Michigan last year, 12 students died, right? Well, somebody actually has to sort of care for that. Yeah, that's soul killing, And how many students didn't die but had all kinds of terrible things happen to them? And how many, these moments, and just down to the simplest thing, are we going to cancel school because of the snow? It's so the weight of responsibility on those people is huge. It is kind of crushing, So if you could be a brilliant researcher or take on that labor, at the end of your career, you could say, I changed my field, or I was a really good administrator and I kind of led the college through some hard times. A lot of people are going to take the former.
No
right?
snow days.
Exactly. Right.
Well, this has been great. Is there anything that we should have discussed that we haven't? Covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, probably not. Let's face it. It's easy for us to be in a kind of requiem moment, right? It's just we got the salad days of it. We got it's the last best job, and we got it, right? My generation, we got it. But I bet every generation's going to be saying that, right? I don't know, but I certainly feel that way. I mean, it's easy to be 55, right? And all of a sudden you feel your age, and you feel the age of institutions that you've been with, and all of a sudden you can get really, it's a different kind of grimness than the 30-year-old, damn, they're corporatizing the university person who's pissed off, right? It's a weariness, it's a kind of tiredness, it's a kind of a kind of a weight that can make you feel depressed. And I guess for me, the antidote to that's always been hanging out with good students. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's the other side of it.
Well, for me, I guess, the reason I feel like I have the last best job is because I find that the three things that we're really judged by, I find to be perfect antidotes to one another. Research, teaching, and administration, if you can figure out how to juggle them, they actually feed different parts of the soul.
It's totally true. I mean, it's the three-legged stool, right? I mean, you're in the classroom, you're like, oh, God, I'm so sick of students, right? I need to go
to a library.
I need to go to a library. You're in a library I'm so lonely for people.
I need a committee meeting.
I need a committee meeting, exactly. That's right. And you just cycle through it, right? Your whole career is like a giant spiral, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Thank you very much, Phil Deloria.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome.